Hi, this is Paul, and I have a very special guest today, Spencer Klavan, who I have never really spoken with before. Marcus from Ireland, who I did an event with last year with Paul Kingsnorth, has set up an event that's coming in Washington, D.C. at the end of July. And I'll be there with Spencer Klavan and Michael Martin, and we'll be talking about Christianity and community in the contemporary world. And so I told Marcus that it would be, I've already had a conversation with Michael. And so I thought before we did this conference, it would be good to get to know Spencer. A lot of the work that I have done in the conferences that I've done have been in conjunction with Jonathan Peugeot and John Vervaeke. The three of us have spoken a lot over the last 5 years, and that has, I do believe that these conferences are improved by the participants developing a degree of trust and rapport and mutual knowledge. And so this was part of why I wanted to get to know Spencer and give him a chance to get to know me. So Spencer, my plan is I'm going to do what on my channel is fairly well known. I'm just going to start asking you a whole bunch of questions, mostly about the development and the trajectory of your life up until now. And you can ask me anything as well too. So that's because you don't have you need a chance to get to know who I am too. And that's the way trust works. So what's interesting about you, Spencer, is that you are the first person that I have ever had a conversation with whose father I have read his spiritual memoir. And I loved that book. I thought that was a beautiful, beautiful book. And you could actually read the book that my father wrote about himself. Hasn't sold quite so many copies, but it would give you a sense of who I am. But let's start with, it's because that sort of gives me a sense of, it's been a few years since I read your father's book, and it's the only book of your father's that I've read. But tell me about your household growing up, especially in the fact that I don't know where you were growing up when your father made a pretty significant transition into Christianity.
Right. It's a very interesting experience to be a secondary character in somebody else's memoir. And I think about this a lot in my own life when I write about personal experience, that of course, you want to be as honest and truthful about the people that you know and love as possible. But any writer or, artist of any kind will tell you that inevitably you end up compressing people. You end up presenting them through your view of things. And so I am very conscious of a kind of responsibility about that, or, something a little bit, there's just a difficulty there. I forget who it was who said that all writers are, it was Joan Didion who said that all writers sort of betray their subjects in some ways. And I don't feel betrayed by my dad's books at all. I like, I think I have like 2 lines in The Great Good Thing.
Yeah, I didn't recall you at all in the book. So
yeah. And so, and that speaks to something that will help me answer your question, maybe, because although my father did have a very transformative, seismic, dramatic, religious transition during my lifetime, over about 10 years of my childhood, it was for him an extremely personal thing, and almost by a matter of principle. I mean, that was the faith context, if there was any, in which I grew up. We did not go to church as kids. We were not schooled in any particular tradition. And if we had a mantra about these issues, it was that we prided ourselves on independent thought, on kind of openness to one another and to differing views of the world. And I think that maybe arose out of both of my parents having had fairly fractious childhoods and not having been very well treated when it came to faith for different reasons, or not somehow feeling satisfied by their religious upbringing. My dad, was bar mitzvahed in a household where he didn't feel like he or anybody else really believed the words that he was saying. My mother sort of went through a sort of cursory series of Catholic educational experiences, also not really deeply related to or integrated into her family life or her beliefs. And so we were one of those families, kind of in you might call it like a secular Jewish caste, a very identifiably secular Jewish caste of mind, that it was going to be about open inquiry and discovery. And so it was in that sort of context, if you like, that I was ever even asking the question, that all roads were open, but no roads were sort of like offered. And so my own faith journey took place almost separately from my dad's in a lot of ways. It was very personal and private as well until it wasn't.
Well, you're not I mean, you're on the screens now, and so yeah. So
Yeah.
so very much a secular. What were some of your first inklings that there might be something to this religious thing? Because I would imagine, and correct me if you're wrong, so you've got a mother who's got some nominal Catholic connections, your father's got some nominal Jewish religious connections. And so religiosity is just sort of out there. It's something other people do, but like, unlike my formation, where my father was a pastor, my grandfather was a pastor. Actually, my great grandfather sent my great grandfather to America because my great grandfather married a Dutch girl, and so got put
Oh,
out of the Jewish community.
wow.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
that's a little strangeness in my story. And then they all
Yeah.
sort of interwove with the Dutch in America. But so what were some of your first impressions and then first inklings that there might be more to this whole religious thing than just it's just sort of a weird thing that other families do?
Yeah. This is one of, to me, the strangest and most mysterious parts of my story, and one of the most sort of grace-filled and blessed facts about my life is that although I had absolutely no kind of formal religious convictions, it was always a matter of course to me to believe in God, to believe in some sort of consciousness or creative care behind the universe. Although, again, I wouldn't have put it that way. As soon as I knew that there was a question about these sorts of things, that some people were atheists and some people were not, I knew that my answer had always reflexively, instinctively been that there was somebody watching, that there was somebody there.
Well, why do you think that was true?
Well, I've wondered whether it was because my life was so great, because I was so comfortable and happy, and that would be maybe a kind of more cynical reading of the situation that just says, well, you sort of associate divine care with your personal circumstances, which happen to be sort of really materially well off, and just things are going well. But I wouldn't say that I was, that everything about my childhood was abundantly happy, that I had no suffering, or that God didn't feel present to me when I was suffering. And so a more generous interpretation, I think, is, in the one line, I think, that I have in my dad's memoir, I go outside, and as a little kid, just sort of instinctively, I say thank you to the sun for shining on me. That's like the thing that apparently my dad remembers about me as a little kid.
How old were you?
And I younger than I can remember, because I don't remember
Okay.
this
But he
happening.
remembered it.
Yes, it struck him at the time. And when I read that, or when he told me that story and then put it in there, I did recognize myself in it very strongly, in the sense that um, the basics of life are very beautiful and good to me, and goodness is a personal concept. It's actually not a impersonal abstraction, or it's something that involves value, that involves people. I mean, the first thing God does in Genesis, right? He looks and says, "It is good." And so I think that the richness of that experience just had I won't say a humanity to it necessarily, but a personhood to it for me always. Um, and maybe it's kind of fitting, since I was a little kid, that it took a very sort of, animist, primitive animist form of faith, that there was somebody out there everywhere, and that's the most generous interpretation of it that I can give.
So that's sort of a base for you. So you have a sense that being is good, that the world is, you understand that there's evil in the world, but talk about now, what are some landmarks that happen where this begins to get either tested or clarified?
Yeah. The first event that I can recall spiritually about myself, and after that moment of, or that general sort of baseline, as you say, of knowing that being is good, that when later on, when I found out that Augustine thought evil was a privation of the good, that it has no actual existence, that it was quite plausible to me, that described sort of how I experienced the world. And one way of describing my whole journey is just successively trying to find philosophical traditions and language that accurately fit the way the world looks to me. The kind of inadequacy of secular philosophy for me is precisely based on how much it doesn't describe, how little of human existence is really captured in, say, a materialist account of the mind, or what have you. And so, as I'm talking, if you don't already know, it'll probably already be becoming clear that I'm sort of a nerd, and that this was also apparent about me from a very early age. And so when I had enough self-awareness to realize that I believed in God, my immediate reaction was not to kind of reach out to other people and ask them about their faith belief, or to go to various churches, but to read as much as I possibly could, and to try and kind of get an inroad into the options, the philosophical options that way. And this is like when I'm about 14 or so. And so I set myself on a course of study, very much in keeping with the kind of upbringing that I just described, in which I just thought, I'm going to read every scriptural text that I can get my hands on. And I did. For like 2 years, I read like the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, the Tao Te Ching, and not with any real sophistication, being a 14-year-old, just sort of cracking them open and seeing what I could find. And that, of course, included the Bible. I did read the Bible in a year, so from Old Testament to New. And I took that to be both my sort of exposure to Jewish and Christian scripture. And it was through that process, not that I arrived at any kind of theology, anything I don't think resembling a theology, but it became clear to me that the character, the person that I felt I had known from a very early age in the world, was most accurately represented in the pages of the Bible, and that the relationship between, the God of Abraham and his people, and his sort of self-revelation through history, and then the person of Jesus Christ looked most like the person that seemed to me behind the veil of the beautiful world. That the mysterious things he said and the lucid things he said both kind of matched up. And it was sort of a feeling of like, oh, that's my guy. And so in that way, I think the Bible, unlike other texts, became somewhere I would turn out of more than interest, out of need. And so, during the sort of subsequent years, I'm sure we'll get into, I started to really feel a great sense of need, in part because, as we have just briefly discussed off air, and as it's impossible not to sort of raise in this context, in part because it was becoming clear to me that I am gay. And, there will be, I'm sure, people listening to us with a whole range of ideas and convictions about what that means, sort of ontologically about me as a person. Probably there are people who think that means I was born this way and this is kind of how God created me. Probably there are people who think that this is a series of just kind of base sexual desires, that just a desire that I have to gratify some particular physical impulse, and everything, I would imagine everything in between. I can only give to you or to the world my own account of what I discovered about myself during that time, which was that far from, being so consumed with sexual desire for other men that I couldn't do otherwise. What was actually happening is that I was falling in love I fell in love with a man. And the only way that that has ever happened, that whole parcel of experiences, the only way that that has ever happened for me, is toward other men. There's no other, and during this time that we're discussing, sort of 14 to 16, I expended a lot of effort in various ways, including prayer, to change that, and got basically nowhere. And so I'm dealing with this fact of my life, which is kind of becoming apparent, is very troublesome to me, not because of anything anyone has told me, but simply because of my own sort of understanding of myself and who I thought I was going to be. And I find myself basically at this kind of impasse, like this impossible juncture. And it's in that moment, late one night, kind of with nowhere else to turn, nothing else to do, that I find myself opening my Bible. And in the opening of my Bible is John 3:16 in a million different languages. It's one of those Gideon's Bibles that just starts with, this is one of the most translated sentences in the world, and here are all of these different versions of it. And I am, as I mentioned, a nerd, and am really into languages. And so I started reading all the different, kind of to placate my mind, reading all the different languages that I could read of this one verse over and over again. For God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten son to live and die as one of us, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. And I had what I can only describe as a sort of mystical experience, which was that the small w, reading it in all these different kind of small w words, all these different ways of using human sounds to encapsulate this idea, it was like the small w words fell away and the capital W word was sort of there in the room with me. And the experience of that reality, the person behind those words, kind of became the primary thing for me. And I want to be very careful here not to represent this moment as one in which suddenly I had all sorts of answers about the questions that I've just kind of invoked in this story, but rather
it wasn't Neo getting something in the back of his head and it just downloaded everything for you.
I wish I knew Kung Fu. I actually do know Kung Fu. This is a separate issue, but Kung Fu is a lot easier than the things we're talking about. And yeah, I guess what did happen there is that it became clear to me what the primary thing was. The first thing of all was that I believed that this statement was true and the things that I had experienced were real. And so it was at that moment that I sort of decided to work things out from there. And that is still, when people come to me with these sorts of with questions about this sort of stuff, that is still the only thing I really tell them. I never say like, oh, you're gay, go be gay, go live your life. I never say, oh, you're gay, God wants you to shut this part of yourself off. I simply say, if you're a Christian, begin from the conviction that God so loved the world that he gave his son to live and die as one of us, and approach that in prayer with scripture and see where that takes you. And so that's sort of what I did. That's what I'm still trying to do.
In those years 14 to 16, where was your father's journey? Was he going to church yet, or were you? I mean, it's one thing to be a nerd and to because nerds tend to run everything between their ears. At some point, you're gonna, you can bring books home, but at some point you want to get out there and start, not just thinking about being a Christian or thinking about loving Jesus, but actually engaging in the bigger thing. So where
Yeah.
was that at this point?
Yeah. And I'm definitely susceptible to the fault that you just kind of indicated. Like that's it takes me way too long to start talking to people about things. Another story about me as a kid that I don't remember, but my parents swear is true, is that when I started learning to speak, I locked myself in the bathroom and practiced sentences before I came out and said anything.
How many siblings do you have?
I have one, and she is just as annoyed by me as you would think. I have
Is
a
she
much
an
older sister.
extrovert?
No, I wouldn't say that. She's
Oh,
very,
okay.
very different from me. We get along great, but it's funny because we were at each other's throats as kids. Growing
Oh
up, we had
my.
a really, really difficult relationship, and she once produced for me when I was doing this project, a sort of biographical project. She gave me all these pictures when I was really little, from before I can remember, and we were getting on. We were thick as thieves. We were getting on great. And I said, Faith, what happened? You and I remember us fighting so much as kids. Now we're super close, but it looks like we were super close back then too. And she said, yeah, basically you learned to talk. And that's when things went wrong. Do you have siblings, Paul?
I have two siblings. I have an older and a
Okay.
younger sister. So I was bracketed by two sisters.
Okay. Yeah.
And I
Is
have
that where
five
you?
children. So I've
Mhm.
and four of them are in their 20s and one is in his 30s. So yeah, I often tell people the greatest gift you can give your child is a sibling. And
Mm. That was
because
borne out in your experience, you would say?
um well, it's ironic because I growing up I had a lot of commonality with my younger sister. My younger sister
Yeah.
died in 2018.
Oh,
Um, but I had more conflict with my older sister.
yeah.
Temperamentally, I'm right in between my sisters. My older sister is an artist and a musician and a very free spirit, and my younger sister was a very steady person who loves routine, and I'm right there in the middle. And so
Hmm.
um, I have a terrific relationship with my older sister now. Although in our youth it was a little bit rocky at times. One of
Okay.
the greatest joys that I have now is that all of my children love spending time with each other,
Oh,
and
wow.
now my wife and I love nothing better than to get as many of our kids. And now they're having significant others, and they're getting at that point in their life, and so we love nothing better than to have the kids together and just watching them relate to each other in all the ways that they do. So that's a wonderful thing. But as a pastor, of course, I know many far less happy families, and so that's a reality of this world. But
Yeah.
I also know it. I also know something. I probably was an introvert for um, most of my earlier years, and I've been getting more extroverted the older I get, to the point that
Hmm.
I'm pretty extroverted now.
Yeah.
So, but I can understand the nerddom and the living inside your head and all that kind of stuff.
Yep. Yep. Um, and so to answer your question, I guess, about where my dad was at, where my mom was at this time, they had begun going to an Episcopal church. My father was baptized before I was. And so I definitely sort of saw that and understood that this was, if I really believed in this stuff, this was an essential component of
Yeah.
that, was this ritual of, um, you know, of the confession of sins and the entry into a communion of faith. And so I started to go to church with them, to an Episcopal church down the street from our house. Um, but I also, again, in this sort of stubborn way that had been taught to me, I wanted to wait until I was 18 to be baptized,
Oh,
because I wanted it to be a thing that I had decided to do as a legal adult.
okay.
Um, and that's not because I forget which denomination it would have to be that only believes in adult baptisms, but it's simply a
Not the
it,
Episcopalians.
not certainly not, no. In fact, it was, I think the priest who did my baptism was a little bit bemused. He was a Yalean. I had just gotten into Yale, and so we had a
Oh,
lot. in common, and he, I think, was a little bit sort of amused by all the stuff that we've just been talking, like my kind of methodical, determined approach to this whole thing. But I certainly at that point began to kind of grasp some of the rudiments of the faith and of the sort of liturgical experience, and got pretty into, took pretty seriously to heart the claim that, when you clothe the naked, you meet Christ, and sort of got pretty into service because of that. And that became an important feature of my life, and remains that way, although it's taken a lot of different forms. But yeah, I wasn't baptized until I could do so at the age of majority, which I then promptly did.
Okay. What was high school like for you? Did you go to a public high school, private high school? What did you study? What kind of things did you do?
Yeah, I went to a really wonderful private high school. I had been to a public school as an elementary student. Maybe I should have mentioned that I grew up in London until I was 7. My parents had moved to London right after I was born, and so I had a kind of British education with all of a lot of what you might imagine with the uniforms, and I had a very prim British accent, and I learned to read very early as a result of that. But also really felt relieved when we got to the States and things were a little bit less kind of strict. I'm somebody who demands a lot of himself already all the time.
Where did you move in the States to?
We moved to Santa Barbara, California.
Oh, really? Oh, interesting.
Yeah, hard to beat in terms of.
Yeah, it's a beautiful place if you can afford it.
Yes, it sure is. Exactly right. Yeah. That's yeah. My dad was working on a lot of screenplays at the time, so that was why we were near Hollywood. And
yeah,
he would say that every time he asked somebody, like, where would you live if you had your druthers, if you could do absolutely anything, they would all sort of get this glazed look in their eyes and say, Santa Barbara. I just want to go to Santa Barbara. So we did. We picked up and moved to Santa Barbara. Which, yeah, I mean, that's a funny thing. Speaking of my sister, one thing that she and I talk about a lot is when my sister was born, my dad was a starving artist. And so they lived on like spaghetti in New York. And by the time I was born, my dad had just had his first big bestseller, True Crime. And so basically there's a big gap between us. We're 8 years apart. Oh. And sometimes my sister says, like, I grew up poor and you grew up rich. Like there is there's a sort of truth to that, like, we had this,
and 8 years apart. That
know,
you were a plaything for her until you started speaking,
until I started talking
and opinions.
I ruined everything as I continue to do. It was, it was the beginning of a long and beautiful career of ruining everything.
The world's best puppy until he could talk.
I know.
Oh, interesting.
So we were in Santa Barbara. High school was, it was certainly a great school. I got an excellent education. I'll say that much. A lot of really gifted teachers, including especially my Latin teacher, which would shape the rest of my life forever. That's what I am now. I'm a classicist. That's where I went to grad school, was for classics. And every classicist I know, with very few exceptions, had somewhere down the line that figure that just captivates them. Yep. And I was sort of primed for loving Latin because I loved old books already, but absolutely Magistra Holly Haycock just totally transformed my life. And so we did like independent studies, and there was all sorts of, really rich academic life. I kind of like came into my own senior year and had a little bit more, sort of knew more people, got along better, got a little more popular. But I also, the other thing that I was really lucky about is I kept to this very small, most of my time in high school, I kept to this sort of small group of friends who were also super academic and would like use our lunch hour to do homework in the library and all this nonsense. And we actually really liked each other. We still to this day get along.
Wonderful.
And I don't know that everybody has that in high school. That we had like real friends. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. So then you go to Yale.
Right. Yeah.
What was that like?
It's a funny part of my life because to get into a school like Yale now, I think certainly at that time, which in some ways was like a fever pitch of college admissions in America, um, you really, I think, have to do some pretty unhealthy things
Hmm.
to kind of build the resume that's going to be competitive. And you're still not guaranteed to get in or anything like that. There's a lot of kind of chance involved. There's a lot of, at this point, sort of demographic manipulation going on in the admissions offices. Um, but the way to really kind of give it your best shot is to um, never stop working and never, and never stop sort of taking on new commitments and activities and do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, the service and the this and the APs and whatever. So I think when I got to Yale, I was just profoundly burnt out. I was very and beyond that, I kind of had it in my head that all of this stuff that I was doing to maximize my chances of getting into Yale, I could stop doing that now because I had gotten into Yale. I had literally gotten the one thing that I had wanted since I was like 12. And I thought, okay, now I can just sort of take it easy. And this is actually relevant to the spiritual journey, because one thing I immediately learned, or learned within about a year, is that a lot of that ferocity and discipline and devotion to work and just constant sort of engagement in some sort of activity, a lot of that was not something I was just doing to get into Yale. It did have that purpose, but it was actually much more core and central to who I was. And so suddenly I looked around and I had lost like a year of real devoted work. I had kind of bummed around. I did some singing. I was much more sort of invested in extracurriculars. And a lot of the muscles that I had used to enforce that discipline with myself had atrophied. And also I associated them with this incredibly grueling experience of trying to get into an Ivy League school. And so in that state of atrophy, I gradually, I guess, began to realize that I had lost all of the sort of internal sources of strength that I had relied on, all of my kind of motivation and those sort of natural things. And so I started leaning on God in prayer at like every moment for the strength to say, get out of bed and brush my teeth, and for the kind of focus to read a single chapter, and just things that now seem really, that I really take for granted. I had to kind of rebuild my life prayer by prayer during that time. And I spent a lot of time in the Catholic, in the Catholic Student Center. I actually went to the Catholic Church. And I think part of that was that I was sort of really trying to get the basics back in place. And I was trying to kind of build a structure of like, what are the fundamentals? And Catholic education, with its sort of rigor and its doctrinal certitudes, appealed to me a lot in that moment. But more than anything, what appealed, or what became essential for life, I mean, I've never quite felt comfortable with the language around depression, or clinical depression or anything like that. But looking back, I've thought that perhaps that was what was going on with me, just a kind of loss of, all the got up and go kind of got up and went. And so I think the foundations of my current prayer life were really laid during those years, because I was in such need of help to do anything.
So academically, did you thrive at college? Or it sounds like, I mean, did you struggle but thrive through struggling?
Yeah, I did okay. I think often about how much better I could have done, if I started college tomorrow, what an enormous kind of success I would get out of it. And it's like, that's one of those moments that frequently occurs to me, where I'm having this sort of very intense set of thoughts, and then I realize that it's actually quite banal, and that everybody has exactly these thoughts. And it's very kind of, it's a great relief, that sometimes you're just a cliche. And this is one of those moments. Of course, if I could start college now, I wouldn't need to. That was obviously part of what I was learning, was that the things that I've just been describing to you. But if I hadn't been spending time kind of learning to like get out of bed in the morning, I think I could have done a lot better. But I had, again, some great professors. Ended up, it was my last Roman history professor who even suggested to me that I should go to grad school, because I had been heading for a career in the theater. I thought I wanted to be an actor, and I gradually it was becoming obvious to me that that wasn't the right path for me, because I had, for one thing, I noticed that I liked being on stage. I liked the end result of preparing for acting, but I didn't really like any of the grunt work that went into it. Whereas when it came to scholarship, it was becoming clear that I loved the stuff that you have to do to kind of get the glamour, that actually just sitting in a library and grinding away was kind of an end in itself for me. And so I had this kind of pivot about face at the end of my senior year, and it was my Roman history professor who said, like, we've kind of missed the deadlines for American grad school, but have you thought about doing a master's in the UK, which is how I ended up at Oxford. And just kind of like as a very last minute Hail Mary that turned into my doctorate and turned into 5 of the best years of my life. So there was lots of good that came out of it, for sure.
Well, so you get baptized at 18 in the Episcopal Church?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But you're also getting very into the Roman Catholic tradition. I mean, what was your religious life like at college? Did you go to church? What things did you like?
Yeah, I did. I went to the Catholic mass, as many Sundays as I could. And, looking back, it all seems very kind of haphazard in some sense, that I was just kind of casting about. But I think what I was really trying to do was just understand, it's a very different experience. I think the body of Christ sort of benefits from both of these things. It's very different to come to the faith kind of without a lot of background than to be raised in the faith, of course. And one advantage I think that you have as a kind of newcomer is that none of this stuff is particularly boring or commonplace to you. In fact, a lot of it sounds really bonkers and insane. And you're maybe a little bit freer to kind of come up with expressions of these facts that are sort of acknowledge how incendiary and transformative and bizarre they are, because they don't come quite packaged in the language that every cradle Christian has heard since birth. The major drawback to that, of course, is that you don't have this really strong kind of foundation of education in the faith. And I think I spent a lot of time in college and after sort of surveying different kinds of church services and just seeing, and in some cases sort of trying on like doctrinal commitments, although I wouldn't have said at the time that was what I was doing. At the time, I would have said, oh, yes, I'm going to this charismatic evangelical church. And that's really where it's at, like just the being led by the Spirit and not having any of these kind of, just like Milton says in Paradise Lost, like not having any of these set words for prayer. And I think I got a lot out of each of those experiences. It did not, that, for instance, did not end up being where I landed. But I was discovering a whole new country, a whole new kind of edifice of Christianity, and the Catholicism was kind of where it was at for me in college. Although I never thought that I would become a Catholic. That was sort of not what I was doing, so much as I was really learning and benefiting from my Catholic friends and seeing what we shared and what we didn't.
So you go to Oxford. Now you're in the midst of the Church of England. What talk to me about Oxford, and then talk to me about how, I mean, because on one hand, with classics, you're in a sense facing, I mean, and I would imagine your unfolding faith is probably really nicely merging with your academic interests. You're in a sense, you're sort of not only studying this stuff academically, you're sort of giving an opportunity to try it on as your faith is formed as well. Would that be fair?
Absolutely. And of course, the Episcopal Church, which is the first church I ever encountered, it has a lot of genetic similarities to the Church of England.
Yeah.
And so there were things in the Church of England I certainly recognized, although in the early parts of my grad school career, I was going to sort of a more charismatic kind of C of E church. And so that was really when I was, clapping and rock banding just like every Sunday, and very sort of very drawn to and attracted by the sort of sola fide, sola scriptura of it all. But as you say, there was very much a kind of academic flourishing that merged perfectly with what I was discovering in church, because at this point I was 110% keyed into school again, and have been ever since. That it turned out that those first few years at Yale was sort of an anomaly, and that what lights me on fire really is to be poring over ancient texts. It was in grad school that I read the Bible in the New Testament in Greek for the first time, and that was sort of for the first year. I did a lot of walking in Oxford, a lot of walking and reading, and so I and talk about an experience that will kind of crack the lid off of some of our habitual language for talking about God. Encountering the Greek of the New Testament was like that for me, to suddenly realize, it's not repentance, it's metanoia. It's not forgiveness even, it's aphesis, and it's the same verb that Luke uses to describe Christ giving up the ghost on the cross, and that these things are kind of baked into the language. And so there was like a lot that was becoming really alive for me in scripture during that time. And it sort of occurred to me about halfway through that if I had been studying classics in the 1800s, I would have been learning Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, because those were the classical languages. And this was, now, of course, that's not true at all. The classics has secularized as a discipline, and theology or biblical studies or even, seminary or what have you has kind of gone into this other bucket. And so I found that really unsatisfying and taught myself Hebrew for that reason. And so then set out to read the, Old Testament in its original. And that definitely sort of shaped who I would become as a scholar. I mean, I've become much more of a generalist in a certain sense than most classicists typically are. Most classicists will sort of restrict themselves to Greco-Roman antiquity, speaking very broadly, and will leave theology to the theologians. And so in one level, I've become much more of a magpie. To me, it was much more a feeling of becoming integrated, of sort of understanding how the sort of richness and delight of close reading and scholarship and historiography could kind of enmesh with the very felt emotional relationship to God that I had been working out in the past. So that was a beautiful kind of realization that these things could be integrated, and that's stayed with me for sure.
And it sounds like you've got some you're baptized in the Episcopalian Church, you're going to Roman Catholic Mass, you're experimenting with some charismatic Anglicans out there. When and why did things sort of settle down for you? Or maybe they haven't, in terms of your liturgy, your practice.
Yeah, I think they have. I ended up getting confirmed in the Anglican Church in a much more liturgical, like evensong and smells and bells kind of church at Jesus College Chapel. And that was actually as part of a process of discernment for the ministry. I began to wonder whether that might be the right, whether God might be calling me to.
Well, now preach. This is really getting interesting. Getting into people who wanted to get ministries heads.
They want to be pastors. Only crazy people want to do that.
I right, know, especially when it's intergenerational.
Yeah, imagine. Well, right. So, I mean, I don't know what that. I'd love to hear what that process was like for you. for me, it had to do with wanting, I had realized that I was a scholar, but I hadn't really discovered that I had things to say. I mean, a PhD is an experience of accumulating a lot of information. And at the end of it, you make a book length object, but it's not a book, really. It's a kind of tangible piece of evidence that that information is in you, and you can sort of use it well and make new observations about it. But so it's not a kind of a given that if you're going to do a PhD, you actually have kind of things that you want to talk about, or that you have you want to have a voice, as it were. But there were some chapels that invited students occasionally to give little guest homilies, and I started doing that. I started writing and have since completed a original translation of the prophecy of Isaiah from Hebrew, and I wrote commentary with each chapter to go with that translation. And that was really my first, kind of, if you want to call it blogging, that was my first experience of the kind of stuff I do now, where I write for a wider audience. And so I began to wonder whether this was a gift I was supposed to be using to encourage people to kind of invite them deeper into the tradition of their faith. I found that through my kind of shambolic, untutored, step-by-step kind of reinvent the wheel approach, I had picked up a couple things that I could now sort of say to people, and they would think, oh, like, I actually feel more ready to confess now, or I feel more sort of a sort of burden has been lifted, and noticing that made me wonder whether I should go into ministry. And so I got confirmed. The first step was to see if I wanted to get confirmed, which I definitely did. And through that process, and poring over the 39 articles, and kind of learning more about the Anglican tradition, and also very much to do with what I was thinking about sort of in my research philosophically at the time, I came to the conclusion that liturgy is like really inescapable in some philosophically fundamental way. That symbol.
I lost you for a second there. Liturgy was fundamental. I'm like, don't lose it now.
Come back. It's like
I'm into my first conversation with Jonathan Peugeot when he asked me what my liturgy is. I say, it's a mess. So, liturgy is fundamental. Keep going from there.
Okay, boy. Well, by the way, a superstition of mine is that Satan and his minions interrupt technological connections right when the conversation gets interesting.
I won't be skeptical about that.
In any case, so I guess it's true that the human heart is a factory of idols. I think that's really a core truth. And what that means, to me at least, is that we are perennially in danger of confusing the symbol with the thing that is symbolized. And on some level, that might be just kind of one way of describing what the fall has done to us, like what the fallen state is. And so all of that critique of kind of really minute neo-Pharisaism in some of the high church religion, all of that is well taken and does land with me, and I understand. My kind of asterisk to this is I just don't know that there's any alternative to symbols, because we are embodied creatures. And so, we're constantly, of course, it's true that we are constantly yearning for access to the spirit, for kind of communion with the thing that we know is immaterial about us. But as you don't need the church to tell you this, like Aristotle will tell you that the thing which is immaterial about us is woven forever and always, that we know of, into the flesh. And as I was parsing these things out, it just sort of started to seem to me as if not only does every church need a set of rituals, every church has a set of rituals, including the church whose rituals are to denounce rituals. Like,
Yes,
and
right.
this is sort of why I think I ended up in a more liturgical
Even the
place. Plus, I love
iconoclasts
music.
have icons.
Right, right. Yep. And again, there are a lot of people who could have told me this before I went on a however many years long journey of sort of try and work these things out, pound my head against them on my own. But perhaps that's just not the way I work. And so yeah, that's kind of what I mean. Is this your am I speaking your language here, or am I is this sort of not how you approach these things?
Well, so
Hmm.
so I'm out of the Dutch Calvinist tradition.
Right.
So,
Okay.
and the Christian Reformed Church in North America split off of the Reformed Church of America, which was a descendant of the state church. The Dutch Calvinists could get astoundingly fractious. In
Hmm.
fact, I believe in the middle of the Second World War during the Nazi occupation, the Dutch church had a split over presumptive regeneration. So the Dutchmen like to take their religion, and some of the Dutchmen who still go to church like to take it seriously. And the
Mm.
Christian Reformed Church, the church of my grandfather, my father, and myself, we're currently having a war over same-sex marriage. So
Right.
this is although that is not unique to the Christian Reformed Church, obviously.
Yep.
And I grew up in Paterson, New Jersey, just outside of New York City, and my father spent 36 years pastoring a little Black congregation that sort of grew out of a sort of Dutch Calvinist rescue mission to the African Americans that were taking the jobs of Paterson when
Hmm.
European immigration stopped at the beginning of the 20th century.
Wow.
So that was my formation. And then my first stop out of I had a very because my grandfather and my father were both ministers, and I was very much raised in the church, and I was always called Little Rev. I was the only son of a
Hmm.
minister. I did a fair amount of avoidance when it came to ministerial calling, and so eventually decided that, well, I really liked seminary. I really liked theology. So at some point, I did decide to go to seminary, and then I really didn't want to do what my father did, so I did foreign missions for a while,
Right.
which
Okay.
was in the Dominican Republic in the Caribbean, which was really fascinating. But then I wound up coming back to North America and pastoring a church in many ways similar to my father's church, just on the other coast.
Okay.
So issues of and after a while discovering that I even all those years very much wanting to differentiate myself from my father, finding myself absolutely loving exactly what my father did. Liturgically, sort of a mess. When I got to Sacramento, I was working with a colleague who had planted a church in sort of the seeker methodology downstream from Bill Hybels, who grew up Christian Reformed.
Hmm.
And so that was sort of the heyday of church planting. We helped plant a whole bunch of churches in Sacramento within our denomination. And all of those churches, that the churches tend to be in the wealthier, whiter suburbs around Sacramento, and they've all gone liturgical.
Hmm.
And except my little church, which is not a lot left, but tends to be much more African American. Um,
Yeah.
and so we have liturgically sort of found a place between American evangelicalism, traditional CRC. For example, if I raise the idea of weekly communion, my elders kind of look at me and sigh. So
That's Paul again. There he goes with his
we're
communion
doing
and
it.
his
We're keeping it
yeah.
monthly here. Um,
Okay. Yeah. Hmm.
so, but the calling, the ministerial calling, is an interesting journey,
Yeah.
especially in, let's say, a deeply Protestant tradition, which has the priesthood of all believers. And the Christian Reformed
Right.
Church, supposedly all of the members, all of the saints in church have their own callings by God.
Right.
And everyone says that the minister's calling is just like the others, except nobody in the Christian Reformed Church seems to believe it. They want you on that pedestal, and they have you there for reasons of their own, and they will kick out the pedestal when it serves them as well. So that's sort of the nature of pastoral ministry. So why? So you felt the attraction, you felt the pull. What sort of led you out of that and then into where you went?
Well, it was
Because you're
a
not teaching classics in some school somewhere right now, to the best of
yeah.
my knowledge,
Nope.
which is the usual path.
I definitely hope. I did a lot of teaching in grad school, and I hope to kind of go back there at some point. Not in the sense of I don't think that my, who knows, man plans, God laughs, but I don't think that my path lies sort of in a route back to academia. But I have often thought, I started this podcast, Young Heretics, which is very much kind of a intro to Western Civ. I called it the classical education you didn't know you were missing. And so there's a real kind of teaching bug somewhere in me. And that was part of the, wondering about being a minister as well. But a few things happened again all at once. One was that I sort of realized about myself that kind of personal care, or empathy and personal generosity, it's not a spiritual gift of mine. And
yeah. If you
yeah,
don't have that, ministry can be an awfully hard thing, because it
I
is full
know.
of a lot of inconvenient people.
I can tell, just talking to you, I can immediately tell that this is something you very much have in spades, and I admire it. It's certainly if it's not a spiritual gift, then that means it's certainly a place for me to work and pray on, and try to get better at. But I thought it was probably irresponsible to put myself in a position where one of the main kind of issues, one of the main desiderata, was a thing that I don't feel particularly good at. That might be more about my ego than about what God really wanted from me. There was also the issue of homosexuality, which the Church of England's position is that the Church of England itself is practically draped in a trans flag at this point, and you'll see sort of ceremonies performed all the time and that sort of thing. But it may not be apparent, therefore, to people that the Church of England's official position is actually pretty traditional about human sexuality, that sex is for marriage is between a man and a woman. And so at the time, I was not in any sort of relationship, but I couldn't in good conscience promise to never be in a relationship. And I want to speak delicately here, because these are delicate matters, but in the process of discernment, I felt, at least, that there was a very strong suggestion coming at me that, well, you can sort of say, if you're not in a relationship when you take the vows, you can sort of say that that's your intention, and then if something else happens down the line, well, you just sort of be with a partner, basically. And this is the part of it that, I don't want to sort of represent this as some grand standard principle, but I did not feel that I could, in good faith, begin a ministry of God by telling a lie. That seemed like a really basic,
start. It's a
bad start. And the fact that the suggestion was so was so readily proffered to me also felt corrupt in some fundamental way. And so both of those things just made me feel like, I don't have no desire to be anybody's activist on any topic. And certainly not in this topic. The Church of England, has its position. I would be shocked if they don't have some sort of reckoning about it in the near future. But I neither wished to be the source of that reckoning, nor to kind of enter into it I mean, it would be one thing if I genuinely had gotten into the ministry and then suddenly realized, oh no, I'm in this difficult position where I find out that I'm gay and now I'm a minister, and what do I do and how do I engage with this? But to take it on in this in this way that where my yes would not mean yes and my no would not mean no, it just like I could not see my way to doing that. It didn't. I couldn't see a righteous way to doing that, and so I didn't. And at the same time as that was happening, academia was starting to look less and less to me like the home for everything that I wanted to do with my life, both because politically I'm generally, I hold a lot of views that you would characterize as conservative, I think, in the American context at least. This was before the great, 2020 reckonings, but it was already kind of clear which way the wind was blowing. But also I was sort of remembering at this point that I hadn't gone into academia with this definite. It becomes very easy when you start in academia to kind of put the next foot forward. Well, the next thing is to go for a postdoc, and the next thing is to try to get tenure, and after that you do this, and that becomes a kind of all-consuming logic because everybody around you is trying to do it. And so, as part of my sort of reconsideration that maybe ministry wasn't the right thing, I started to think, well, actually, did I ever sign up for this whole path, or did I just want to do this particular thing, which was get this PhD? And it was at that time that I started applying sort of more widely, and ended up at the Claremont Institute, which is where I work now. And more broadly, sort of started to gain some traction, as we say, online. And the stuff that I was doing that had kind of led me to think maybe I was in ministry was sort of finding its audience elsewhere. And that kind of brings us to present day, that now I am, attempting to offer that thing that didn't seem like academia. It didn't seem like I was gonna do it by writing a bunch of scholarly monographs. Nothing against scholarly monographs. It just didn't seem like what, there's that wonderful quote where the world's deepest hunger meets your deepest joy.
Yeah.
And this was kind of what I was discovering. And now there genuinely is almost no distance between what I wake up and do in the morning and what I do in my off hours, which is an enormous gift, an incredible blessing. But also, it will explain something to you of why my sister found me so annoying.
No, I get that. And now, so you've got a blog, you've got a podcast. Are you independent? Are you part of Daily Wire? I mean, where do you sort of land right now?
Yeah. Well, I am still employed by the Claremont Institute.
Okay.
And happily so.
Okay.
But one great
and what
thing
is the Claremont Institute?
Okay. So the Claremont Institute is a think tank for the recovery and defense of the American idea. So we publish a quarterly journal, the Claremont Review of Books, and we also have an online publication, The American Mind. That's probably our kind of most, CRB and American Mind are probably the thing that people associate with us, if they associate anything at all. But Claremont does a whole bunch of other stuff, including fellowships during the summer for young people in career, early career folks, political activism in our, DC. Maybe activism is the wrong word. I don't want to get us in trouble as whatever 501c3 rules are. I'm very bad at knowing. But no, I don't. We have like a separate branch, the DC branch, that sort of gets more involved actively in policy papers and that sort of thing. But Claremont is a much sort of, it's a political philosophy shop. It's a lot smaller than kind of the big, think tanks you'll have heard of, like AEI um, and that lot. Um, and what I love about it is that we we are genuinely a group of people who share one thing, and that is a kind of wholehearted endorsement of and desire to know better the philosophy of the American founding, and to kind of figure out together what that would look like to live it out in 2023. And that's the project. I mean, we kind of became known for a while as like a Trumpy think tank, because some of our scholars made some of the best, I think, arguments for Trump in 2016. But we are by no means the organ of any party or clique. I mean, there's DeSantis lovers, there's Trumpists, there's even some sort of third party curious folks associated with Claremont. It's a broad tent in that way. But I'm an editor there. I'm the associate editor at CRB and at the American Mind.
Now, it's interesting that we hardly talked politics in any of your narrative. That could obviously be just a function of the conversation. And this is interesting to me because, well, there's obviously a deep, the American founders, the American founders in many ways were ardent classicists, and you can't visit Washington, D.C. and not not understand the way the New World points back to certain elements of the Old World. You've got an obelisk as the Washington Monument. You've got the Lincoln Memorial as a is that the Temple of Zeus? Is that the Lincoln Memorial? There he sits on the big chair.
Right.
So yeah. And yet, you don't sound like an activist. And you haven't sounded like an activist. So how does that work for you?
Right. Well, one way into this sort of part of my life or work is that I genuinely view America as the most advanced thing that the West has produced politically, that the Western tradition of political philosophy has produced. And the very self-conscious kind of engagement with, connection to classical models that you alluded to among the founders, strikes me as warranted and merited. That is, they thought they were carrying forth the best of what this history had yet produced. And they were doing that. We're, in my view, on very rocky shores at the moment politically. In fact, I think it would be very difficult for anybody to disagree with that. But it in part because I'm not an activist, and because I'm not looking for a fight, but because I am really devoted to honesty. Not in the sense that I'm always perfectly honest, because I suck just like everybody else, but that, like, I really have an aspiration to that. That is something that I want to do at all times, and to be as transparent and forthright as possible. And for that reason, just by sort of saying how things look to me, I have certainly ended up in very controversial places and positions. And my sort of political stance now, as the world goes awry, is like practically fascistic, relative to the rhetoric. Not that I actually am a fascist, but just that I believe a lot of the things that now make you a sort of neo-Nazi or whatever terrible slur you might throw at me. And I should be, clear that I don't accept any of those labels at all. I think I'm a kind of old school
Please be
Americanist.
clear about that.
Yeah.
I'd like to not be demonetized.
Let me be like as plain as possible. I do not believe in race science. I'm not like I
nothing
hear
in your
about
bio has led me to believe you are that. But while we're talking, let's at least be clear.
Let's just like enunciate that. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm trying. This is here I go. I'm getting you in hot water now just by getting myself in it. No, what do I mean by this? I'm simply saying that like, if you sit in one place and just try to articulate the truth as you see it, I think you will often find that the world kind of goes mad around you. And the great figures of history that I admire often have had the quality of sort of just seeming to me to do that, to make their best effort at describing the truth as they see it, and to then become like totally pilloried and hamstrung from it. I mean, Socrates is sort of the classic example, but I think St. Thomas More is a great example of this. And so if I've ended up in a place that is quite expressly political, it's not really, I mean, it is because of things I believe, certainly, but it's not because I sort of signed up for a team and I want that team to win always. It's because I genuinely think that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure those rights, governments are ordained among men. You know, I think that is true and the best and justest way to do politics. And it's very, very out of favor for all sorts of reasons, or even the effort to think about what it might look like can get you into all sorts of nasty places. So Claremont, you know, I believe a vast majority of what my Claremont colleagues believe. We have disagreements as everybody does, but by the time I had sort of formed my own opinions enough to know what I thought, Claremont was very much in line with them. And they had room and interest for somebody like me who comes from a more literary background, wants the right in general to get better at thinking culturally, and you know, is sort of willing to talk about that in a way that is sort of unabashed by political pieties, I guess is one way to put it.
How do you, I mean, you just quoted Jefferson cribbing Locke.
Yeah.
One of the big, you know, as I look at the conversation today, one of the big questions is the viability of liberalism.
Right.
On my channel, I've regularly, Tim Keller, before he passed, did a very interesting interview where he quoted Rowan Williams about programmatic liberalism and procedural liberalism. One of the things that I see happening in the culture now is skepticism on both the right and the left with respect to the viability of liberalism. Listening to Tom Holland, reading Dominion, thinking about the nature, to the degree to which, let's say, Western secularism, particularly the American model, in some way established sort of a hidden church. Looking at Robert Bella's thesis in the 1960s about listening to John F. Kennedy, and even your roots in some ways, there's, I don't know about your roots personally, but maybe academically, the loss of the current, let's say, the current progressive elite of America continues to sort of be the trajectory of the WASP establishment, that sort of continued on past
Mhm.
the Cold War.
Yeah.
So why do you think liberalism remains viable, and to what degree is it dependent upon Christian foundations?
Right. Well, I have described liberalism in the past as a kind of jewel set in a crown, that it can't actually sit on its own. It requires an enormous architecture of support, both cultural and indeed, in some cases, legal. And what I think happened essentially is that those supports were so strongly in place at the kind of high noon of the Enlightenment that they took on a certain invisibility. And you can see this in the early texts of liberalism or proto liberalism, that each one will take for granted that there are actually some things that are beyond the remit of just sort of the very wide latitude that we're supposed to give to free thought and conversation. So I'm thinking here of Milton's Areopagitica, in which he makes one of the great arguments for a free press, and even just sort of in passing, um, he's arguing against licensing, against sort of censors who will read texts before they come out to the public. He says, in passing, of course, we're not going to allow atheists to talk. Naturally, there will be no atheists. We're not savages.
That's deplatform, though.
Exactly,
those godless
deplatform.
modernists.
That's right. Yeah, and this is, I think, this is what I mean by the crown in which the jewel is set. Not that I'm suggesting, in the bright new future of post-liberalism, atheists will be prohibited from publishing books, but simply that these arguments for liberalism at their heyday took for granted that you could do liberalism because of this enormous inherited cultural capital from centuries of European development. And so, to me, these critiques of liberalism that you are identifying, Patrick Deneen, these sort of integralist arguments, they're mostly true about liberalism as a freestanding ideology, as an all-consuming, exhaustive description of humanity. That it's actually paralyzing to make infinite choice your only standard, and it ends you up in a situation where the implicit value is placed always upon transgression, because transgression makes the exercise of choice sort of manifestly intentional. And in order to establish the bona fides of your intentional authenticity and freedom, you have to make more and more kind of extravagant deviations from the norm. And that strikes me as a pretty accurate description of our present circumstances. That once transgression becomes sort of the only remaining ideal, you've ended up very quickly in a kind of rolling escalation that will just lead to kind of further greater and greater depravity, all the while having installed the greatest taboo of all, which is the taboo against speaking about, or speaking negatively about liberalism, right? Raising the possibility that this might not be working so well. You only have to start talking about that for a moment before you realize that there is a very strict set of taboos. And as you sort of indicated, this amounts to an unspoken but incredibly oppressive regime. It amounts to sort of this this all-encompassing set of claims on what can and can't be said and thought, which is precisely the opposite of what liberalism promised to deliver. And so one, I think, thing that you could plausibly take from all of this, if you were looking out at what's going on now and we're about to embark upon the liturgical month of June, which is Pride season, and it will become, I'm sure, offensively evident that all of these things are true. And one very easy conclusion that would not be unreasonable to draw is, well, because liberalism's claims are totalizing per se, this was always bound to happen. You can't put the jewel in the crown. It sort of eats away at everything around it until all that's left is people twerking on crucifixes, like these incredibly grotesque displays of self-conscious transgression. And so I think that we have a challenge and a danger before us, because it's like, if that's the case, and really what we have to scrap is just liberalism altogether, the slippery slope remains undefeated. It was always slippery from the very beginning. It's like, the question for me is then going to become, well, how far are we going to go back up that slope, right? And what exactly, are you talking pre-America? Are you talking monarchy? Was it the birth control pill where everything went wrong? Was it no-fault divorce? Was it gay marriage? Like, what exactly was the moment when we embarked on that slippery slope? And the problem for me is it's actually very difficult to identify that point, because in fact, there is a sphere of action for which individual choice is the right and proper best rubric, even if people choose wrong. And so what we really need to do is not sort of find our way back to some sort of anti-liberal kind of pre-modernity that's going to lock people in place into where everything is perfect and nobody does anything that has even remotely the chance of going wrong. But figure out a way, if possible, to reestablish the kind of ground rules that make liberalism possible at all. Ground rules of family formation, of shared cultural life, of communal prayer. I mean, these are things that the founders were actually not allergic to, despite what you may have heard. And I think that those things are going to look different in 2023 America than they did in 1776 America. But they are going to look like America. Like, I don't think America looks like anything else. I don't think that the founders were liberals in the sense that we've been talking about, in this unfettered sense. Certainly John Adams wasn't. Jefferson might have been a little bit more kind of enamored of the French, but a lot of them understood, Washington certainly, that this was not, what they were delivering was not simply unfettered liberalism. They were delivering the conditions within which the benefits of liberalism could be enjoyed. And I think that if we're going to reestablish something that looks like America, it's going to have to involve kind of understanding where those limits of liberalism are, which is like a hard and kind of case by case task. And my fear is that we're not equipped for it, but my hope is that we will actually sort of try to undertake it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because in some ways, the first time around, in terms of this project, let's say the first 250 years, we had the benefit of that, the borders on that landscape being implicitly embraced. We didn't have to explicitly embrace them. They didn't need to be, they were part of the landscape. And obviously part of, again, Tim Keller, this quote that I use fairly often, that he did. I mean, so much of America was raised with that landscape so deep within them, it was simply unquestioned. And many of the arguments of a restoration of let's say productive liberalism rest upon a populace that is deeply pious and formed by the roots of what you have spent your career studying. And, it's also, it's also true that, we're going to be having this event at a Roman Catholic institution. I mean, the way that, obviously in the middle of the 20th century, the main dialogue was, Protestant, Catholic, Jew, and the conversations around segregation and integration were black and white.
Yeah.
And part of what we're simply dealing with now is, this supernova of options. I mean, pluralism in the middle of the 20th century had fairly well-defined borders. Now in the 2020s, in the next century, they're way out here.
Yeah.
And when I look at where I see a lot of the conversation going, I sort of got my launch on YouTube by sort of haplessly making videos about Jordan Peterson's biblical series, and continuing to, how on earth did a Dutch Calvinist minister of a dying nothing church in Sacramento, California, ever wind up in this space? It's because, I see a lot of the struggle now in the quest for new foundations.
Yep.
I think, in the Protestant Reformation, fueled by the printing press, the institutional foundations of Catholicism and Christendom obviously were giving way, especially in certain parts of Europe, and the Protestant Reformation forcing a reformation of much of the Roman Catholic Church in Trent. And then sort of the Enlightenment and modernity sort of holding things together for a while. And now with the kinds of globalism that happens in the post-World War II world, suddenly the options on everybody's menu seem so absolutely way too broad for any of us to actually manage. The idea that sort of materialism from below and rationality from above could sort of contain this and give humanity a new universal foundation, that seems to have given way via cognitive science. And so politically, we're in a space where, one of the funniest things I saw on Twitter last week was the deep fake of Hillary Clinton endorsing Ron DeSantis, which I thought was just hilarious on so many levels.
Yeah. Oh boy.
And so, I think as a minister, I see ponds and puddles of communities that have inherited their religion, like, my own denomination, in deep distress. Same-sex marriage might be, I think in some ways, same-sex marriage is the COVID meeting the patient with heart disease, diabetes, and COPD. And because, what had been happening in the Christian Reformed Church is, in some of the rural, more conservative places in the United States, those churches not thriving necessarily so much, but doing better than, let's say, the churches in the urban areas. And now in the YouTube space, watching sort of a new interest in orthodoxy, which is very interesting choice, a new interest in, let's say, Latin Mass Catholicism, a real hungering for roots in an age where, well, there's just so many root stocks to pick from. And so when I look at the conversations, and I look at, say, Jordan Peterson in his biblical series, I see a, sort of the wedding of classics and symbolism and humanities with psychology to say, perhaps there is a structure, sort of a new interest in natural law. Perhaps there is
Yep.
a structure that we can learn from, and perhaps we can again have a degree of confidence that isn't simply fideistic in
Mm.
God and the world. And so, it's as a pastor, I don't deal with these things in the abstract. I deal
All
with
right.
them in the particulars and the concrete of, the older generation that tends to be in my local church, but then the younger generations that tend to be out there in YouTube land, and them
Mm.
looking for a way that reliably yields life and flourishing and faith, and not simply distraction, dissipation, and nihilism.
Mm.
So I think that's
Wow.
probably a lot of what Marcus is going to want to talk about in the conference,
Yep.
because that very much seems to be where things are. And then the legacy religions, as John Vervaeke calls them, Protestantism, Catholicism, and now Orthodoxy coming on the scene in America. These stewards of the religious traditions working to not only, working at multiple levels
Right.
to revive and reform and really help make things plausible on a mass scale, because you have the sense that in many ways religions are using, it's so difficult, we're using we're using the psychotechnologies of every previous generation
Mm.
now in the midst of this internet fueled, social media laden world, which sort of disrupts everything. I don't know, I just went
Yes.
on a rant. Does that make any sense?
Enormously. Yes. It's very well put, and it's making me excited to do our conference because I think we obviously have a lot to say to one another on this topic. A few things occur to me. One concept that has kind of obsessed me for a couple years now is the notion of honor, which is a classical notion. And it obsesses me because it strikes me as a kind of third category between legal and illegal,
Hmm.
or permissible and impermissible. And it's one of the many problems facing us, it seems, is that, here we are talking about an enormously rich and complex, and I think very real effort. It's almost going on underneath a lot of kind of grabby headlines and news cycle-y kind of stories, um, that has to do with voices crying in the dark, with sort of people reaching out for something, anything that satisfies more than sort of postmodern liberalism and hyper atomized uh, consumerism. And the hungry sheep look up and are not fed. There's no question about that. That like there's something kind of that we have yet to offer one another. Um, and then all of these difficult and complex issues have to sort of get cashed out in terms of like, well, are we going to like make this thing legal or illegal? Are we going
Hmm.
to outlaw birth control, let's say, or keep it in the keep it on the market? And that there's very little room to maneuver in that rubric, and very few kind of notes to sound that reflect the whole symphony of sort of what's going on. And the category of honor, it seems to me, um, creates the possibility, and has, first of all, there are degrees of honor, so that's appealing for one thing. You can be more or less honored. You can't be more or less illegal. You can only be illegal or legal. And it creates this entire middle space of things that, as a society, as a civilization, we wish to endorse and encourage without sort of depriving ourselves of everything, every other possibility on the table. Um, and one thing that a robust sort of new liberalism, I think, would need to do is regain confidence and comfort with honoring certain things over others. That, for instance, like a man and a woman having a child in a family in wedlock, um, even if there are other family arrangements that we think should be licit, um, and even if we think there are some family arrangements that should not be permitted, but there's a range beyond just that one. At the same time, we want to find some way, politically, interpersonally, culturally, in our churches and our communities, of saying, okay, but this is the archetype. Like, this is the core, this is the center around which the variations dance. I mean, I know you're friends with Jonathan Pajot, and he's got this wonderful concept of marginalia, right? That there are in medieval manuscripts these kind of variations, things that you would never want to be the center, like little gargoyles and priests doing weird stuff. And like, you would never want that to be at the center of the painting, but to have them is kind of a joy. It's part of the profusion of life. And so all of this simply to say, lately in conversations that I'm having with friends about kind of our political predicament, I am trying really hard to force myself and to ask others to say, like, okay, what do you think should be off the table altogether? What do you think should be on the table in terms of like how we're going to live together, what we're going to do? And then what do you think we should elevate and honor and incentivize as sort of the ideal? Because if there's anything that I think people are really lacking, and maybe you can tell me whether I'm off base here as somebody that does have that gift, pastoral care, and who talks to people, but it's like a model, an archetype for living, is so absent. In fact, it's kind of one of the great taboos. It's prohibited to say, like, this is the way you should live, because it immediately gets read as an insult. Right. And all of the things that about your life that aren't this way are deficient and contemptible. Because again, all we can think about is that they should be made illegal. They should be excised from life altogether. Right. Whereas in truth, of course, like, each of us is always in that relationship to the archetypes. We are always sort of in some way marginal and in some way kind of striving toward the center. And so, yeah, what I think is kind of missing a lot of the time is the ability to sort of say, like, okay, what do we want life to look like for most people, so that they can have something to aspire to, and not feel totally kind of adrift at sea in the enormity of their choices. And then kind of what room is there around the edges? Like, that just seems like a more fruitful way of having these sorts of conversations than kind of.
I very much agree, and I think Jonathan has been tremendously helpful, and I think Jordan has been. I think Jonathan and Jordan have sort of been working together well in this. I don't know if I'd frame it in terms of honor, because when I hear honor, I sort of puts me to shame in honor cultures, which have some of this. But I think we're looking for ideals, and to say, okay, here is an ideal, and we all understand that this is basically the argument I've made in my denomination. You have an ideal, and ideals are sort of edge cases in that they can't be improved upon. And those things which fall short of the ideal, it's not that you don't tolerate, you have to tolerate, because nothing ever hits the ideal. There is no, you're not going to find a marriage in this world that is ideal. Even the best marriages, you will find ways that could have been improved in one way or another. But ideals and the culture, the culture that embodies these ideals and can agree upon these ideals, can sort of develop sort of a reverse gravity that pulls people up with these ideals.
Right.
Part of the difficulty I think we face, and this is a long-term difficulty, is always the tension between the hierarchical and the egalitarian. And in some ways, if you want to blame somebody for this, you kind of have to blame Jesus, because he on one hand, he walks around calling himself the Son of Man, which anyone in his day would have immediately thought of Daniel 7, where the great sea monsters are, the Ancient of Days sets up throne, and the Son of Man comes with the clouds of heaven, and Jesus is walking around. Are you the Son of God?
Uh,
The Son of Man.
yeah. Wow, yeah.
Jesus, I admonish my people, if they're going to fight a culture war, to do it like Jesus,
Mm,
because I think if you actually read the Gospels, you will get a master class in navigating a culture war, because Jesus' culture war was, just as hot and deadly as our own, if at least
right.
with a smaller geographical footprint.
Right.
And unfortunately, it did in fact lead to obviously the destruction of the temple, but the way in which Jesus engaged the broader issues of the Roman Empire, obviously transformed the world.
Mm,
And so Jesus, on one hand, you know, Lewis, of course, with his trilemma, nicely frames this. Jesus, unlike Muhammad, unlike Siddhartha Gautama, unlike Socrates, declares himself to have been, to be the
mm.
very Son of God,
Yeah.
and at the same time says, you shall, the Gentiles lord it over each other. You'll not do that. You are all brothers and you have one master. And it's like, okay, so you have this radical hierarchy and you have this radical egalitarianism. And so then, part of what we're facing is, I think, with the loss of a deeply implicit agreement about ideals,
Mm,
it becomes very people's sort of a false egalitarianism becomes a security blanket. And I think
mm,
this was in American culture before, before the second half of the 20th century, but sort of comes to full flourishing, that no one is better than another. Well, that language is way too low resolution, because
mm,
obviously everybody's better at something than other things, but to sort of have a nested set of ideals in a culture is really what defines a culture.
mm.
And so, for example, marriage and the family, on one hand, you say, well, this is your ideal, and I find it very difficult to improve upon one man, one woman for life as an ideal. But
Mm.
now you have to deal with all of the rest of us, which is really all of us,
Right.
who never actually managed to hit that ideal. Now, you might manage one man, one woman for life and avoid divorce, but anyone living in that home will probably testify to the fact that it wasn't an ideal marriage, because there are other elements of the ideal that don't make it. And then what on earth do you do with others who can't do it? And also, that's just an ideal for marriage. The marriage
Right.
ideal is not the ideal for humanity, because, of course, obviously in the Bible, to the best of our knowledge, Jesus never married. The Apostle Paul never married.
Right.
So, I mean, this is an enormous conversation the church has actually been having for centuries,
Right.
and we're still having it now. But that's only one thing. I mean, marriage is just one segment of life. There are
Right.
all these other segments of life, and politically, it goes from there. So I think you're
Mm,
right in that having conversations about ideals rather than transgressions tends to put us on a better footing, and
mm,
hopefully lead us to better conversations about, okay, what can we agree to, and where in fact, um, what will be tolerated where, when, and how,
yep. Yep.
rather than, you know what must be. And again, part of my thinking lately has also been the fact that Dennis Prager said something very interesting in the Exodus seminar, when he
Mm-hmm.
said, there are a whole variety of capital crimes in the Torah, but it seems like murder is about the only one that you can find examples of it actually being, um, being
Right.
enacted.
Right. Right. Yeah.
And
Mm,
and you find that, I mean, a close reading of the Bible actually reveals a whole bunch of things. You find all this hyperbolic language, and then if you sort of took the hyperbolic language in a very modernist, literalistic, physicalistic sense, the
mm.
rest of the text wouldn't make any sense. And so you very much are bumping into the fact that Well, maybe language, the relationship between the concordance between language and the physical world didn't exactly work for them in the pre-modern period. Like suddenly in the modern period, we assume it does, because, it boggles people's minds that, people haven't needed passports until basically 50 or 100 years ago. People, borders were rather,
Yeah.
fictitious things. I mean, there have been so many ways in which the imaginal of the world,
Right.
the imaginary has sort of changed in the last 100 years,
Right.
that when we read older texts, we don't really quite understand, well, how exactly was that put into practice? One of my favorite examples of this is Koreans are 10% of the Christian Reformed Church today, and they're a very conservative bunch. And if
Yeah.
you would ask almost any Korean minister, what about women serving in ecclesiastical office? No, that's definitely not permitted. I'm a synodical deputy, and I visit 2 Korean language classes that we have in California, and I'm sitting in one, and in walks this woman, and the person translating for me says, "There's a woman pastor." I said, "What? What do you mean? This is a Korean woman pastoring in this Korean classes? I know how they all feel about women in office, yes,
Right. Right.
but she's a pastor, yes." And when I was in the Dominican Republic, it was the same thing all over the place. Women must be
Right.
silent in the church. I'd regularly go into many churches in which the dama misionera was the most powerful person in the church, and it's like,
Yeah.
so in other words, um, we societies have always functioned with an economy of ideals,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and generally speaking, the individual's capacity to sort of flesh out that economy of ideals was always limited, but they understood, as I think Pajot nicely says, there are sort of core cases and there are fringe cases, and you have to let the fringe be the fringe.
Right. Right.
So
Oh, and indeed, the fringe has to grasp and understand and even appreciate, accept its position on the fringe. This is something that I think Lewis articulates in Screwtape Proposes a Toast, right? That the translation of democracy into "I'm as good as you" is sort of the satanic perversion of all those sort of nice egalitarian ideals that, as you say, we know that all men aren't created equal in all sorts of ways. And so it must be a higher order equality that we're referring to when we use that language. And much as you indicate, scripture is very comfortable speaking bluntly and plainly in higher order language, without feeling the need, or even without finding it wise, to sort of spell out the subordinate levels on which there may be exceptions to the rule. I mean, one thing that I've noticed about the way that we tend to defend scripture today is that because the major assault on sort of scriptural truth in the last several generations has come from a sort of scientistic position that is, you know, modern science, since the advent of basically, since the publishing of Newton's Principia and perhaps Darwin's Origin of Species, it's been clear that these questions are sort of resolved without the use of scripture, sometimes in ways that contradict what it says in scripture. And look, here's our evidence, right? Here is the fossil, here's the sort of Assyrian text, here's whatever thing we think kind of countermands what scripture says. One typical reflex to that form of attack is to say, no, you're wrong. Scripture is true, and I can prove it. Here's my fossil bone. Here's my sedimentary layer. Here's my... Without really realizing that in responding that way, we've sort of accepted the entire philosophical, epistemological premise of the worldview we're trying to sort of countermand or offer an alternative to, and just imported it right into our exegesis. Like just took that wholesale and said, yeah, the Bible is true. And the way we know is because it can be scientifically proven. And it's like, not only is that I think a losing game in a lot of cases where when you're dealing with poetry or what have you, it also deprives you utterly of all the weapons in your arsenal, all the modes of sort of human speech and engagement that don't sort of satisfy the demands of scientific physical science. You've sort of rendered those unintelligible to yourself, as indeed they are unintelligible to the kind of dogmatical materialists who can't read in any other way than the kind of basely literal. And so it certainly seems as if the church has kind of gotten itself wrapped up in this kind of losing fight, because the terms were set by the adversary, not to say by like evil bad people doing atheism, but like by a whole philosophical and epistemological worldview that we don't really care to accept, so far as I can tell. And to your point about kind of the implicit, right, and the unspoken, which is really how those cultures you're describing tend to operate, right? Nobody will ever say that. We'll always say women shouldn't teach. Also, here are these women who teach. That's all we have to say about it, right? That's literally the full extent. You have exhausted the limits of wisdom once you have said those things. Like beyond that, you're only going to make things worse. And this is sort of like that mode of talking has kind of been closed off for us by our efforts to justify ourselves in terms set by kind of liberalism and the scientific revolution.
No, I think that's right. The questions, then to sort of swing back to liberalism, it was obvious that René Girard's observation about mimetic rivalry, where the rivals in a mimetic game very quickly begin to mirror each other. You see that in, it's very interesting what happens in the Protestant Reformation, how the Roman Catholic Church in many ways Luther is one of the greatest Roman Catholic reformers. Now, he's also one of the greatest heretics, but Trent has to come around and address. Right. And some of what gets lost then in that Reformation of Catholicism now, in fact, we are going to have a group in the church that investigates miracles, and we're going to formalize the process of canonization. Now, obviously, there's a whole lot to be gained in that, but then there's something to be lost in that. In the modernist fundamentalist fight, you're exactly right. The fundamentalists, the modernists, basically say, well, we're deeply skeptical about the relationship between the Bible and what we now mean when we use the word history, which sort of is a modern correspondentism. And the fundamentalists say, and so the miracles and stuff in the Bible, these are symbolic. And the fundamentalists, turn around and say, no, they're not. And then suddenly you have dispensationalism, which wants to, kind of go through all of the Old Testament prophecy and line them all up and say all of this must happen before Jesus is true. And by the way, everything Jesus says in the Gospels don't have anything to say to the church. Only Paul speaks to the church. I mean, on and on and on we go with this stuff.
By the way, this cultural phenomenon was one of the most alarming and strange things to encounter as a kind of outsider coming into the church. That you're like, oh, you're a scholar who thinks about scripture. What's your view on dispensationalism? And after it was explained to me what that even meant, I was like, not only do I not have a view on that series of questions, my view is actually not to have a view. Like that's actually sort of part of my answer, is that it's above my pay grade. So I'm glad to hear you say that, because that was it still strikes me as a very odd practice that immediately it's almost like a secret handshake. It's like, oh, you're a CRC. What's your where do you stay? Are you pre or post trib?
Right,
right.
Like,
Yeah.
Right. No,
I'm
I
like,
know. And it's so
trib
funny.
somewhere else, trib away from me. Like that's sort of
And
what
now post Jonathan Peugeot, I have people coming up and say, wow, Protestants don't do symbolism. I thought, have you met a dispensationalist? They love symbolism.
Oh my gosh, they're so into it.
They have their whole realm of symbolism.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
They,
no, and so and I guess, I think part of the struggle with liberalism is, of course, going to be, and I enter a lot of these conversations as a Protestant,
mm,
and I'm very upfront with them. I say I remain a Protestant, even though my beard can get long sometimes. I'm not sneaking into Orthodoxy. I have
yeah.
absolutely no plans to join Rome. I will probably remain Christian Reformed for as long as there is Christian Reformed. We'll see how long that goes. After this synod, I'm not quite sure how long it will go, but we'll see.
Yeah.
But yet, these the the same, and so where I sort of differ from a lot of the Orthodox and perhaps some of the Roman Catholics is I look at the Enlightenment and the Protestant Reformation, and I can very much see some of the problems that it created, but I also look at it and say, this probably we certainly didn't deal with it as well as we could have, but I very much doubt that the issues raised through it were going to be able to be dodged. And I
Yes.
feel in some ways the same way about the challenge of liberalism, where there, at least in the United States, it's so interesting because, of course, in Catholic lands, they had to have some working out of the relationship between the Pope and the Emperor or the King. And of course, I've been reading, the history of Vatican I and Vatican II. It's a fascinating history, Gallicanism versus Ultramontanism, a supremely elevated Pope in sort of the height of the modern period where you have the divine right of kings. Human beings fight in very interesting and strange ways. And I'm sure 100 or 200 years from now, people will look back on this period and see our blind spots and our strangenesses as well. But, it's the American system was in many ways built on this very strange implicit agreements within Protestantism that had certain tolerations and certain foundations, let's say. I mean, because very early on, the Puritans had to figure out what on earth to do with those Quakers. And then, of course, the Pilgrims come over first, and then more Puritans come over, and America is sort of the release valve for all sorts of English dissenters and ambitious English that want to make a piece of the new tobacco drug trade that was sweeping the world. I mean, it's a very strange history, and that it in fact actually has worked remarkably well is really quite, I think, a gift from God. We worked so well that in many ways, of course, America achieved an empire that wasn't built on, much of it wasn't built directly on its troops, but upon the influence that it had, where, religious tolerance and freedom of religion became the norm in the West rather than, exceptions. So in many ways, I agree that I think that the world did receive great blessings through this American experiment. But I think it then is in many ways incumbent upon America to figure out how to keep experimenting well.
Yeah,
we don't have some of the challenges that, let's say, France or many of the ethno-nationalist history, countries with ethno-nationalist histories have to deal with. We've always had a credo nationalist history, and certainly, as Dr. King made evident, imperfectly applied. But Martin Luther King, in fact, reached back to the Declaration of Independence and calls it, says this is a promissory note, and now the note is due. How do we together then find foundations? And I think in many ways, underneath all of these arguments are the question of, to what degree, pluralism. How can we how can we find the will of God amidst the cacophony of voices, traditions, and worldviews. So
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned Tom Holland earlier in Dominion, and I think one of the great strengths of that book is to show in some detail the extent to which um, we kind of have Jesus to blame for a lot of our squabbles. You know, that you mentioned this in relation to kind of the equality question, but you know, I would suggest that the ideal issue that we're talking through is also a kind of gospel inspired problem, in the sense that it's those strange sayings in Matthew that if you even so much as think about, you know, look at another woman in lust, you have committed adultery in your heart. You know, if you say to your brother, you fool, you have murdered, you know, you are liable to Gehenna. And suddenly it becomes impossible, you know, to take that seriously and believe that anybody is living the ideal, you know. And this is one of those things that we can kid ourselves about, do kid ourselves about all the time. But I think it's kind of inescapable. I mean, this thing where you say, judge not lest you be judged, right? You know, take the plank out of your own eye, then take the speck out of your brother's eye. I mean, I will hear people say, well, okay, so yeah, so now I've done that. And now I'm going to take the speck out of my brother's eye because I've, you know, confessed my sins and I sort of cleansed this. And I, I just have to feel as if that's a kind of an overly literalist reading of what is obviously, as you say, a kind like a pointedly hyperbolic set of statements, right? That the thing we are dealing with, our distance from the ideal, is in some sense always infinite. And you know, for all that we invent clever ways to deny it, we know, you know, that these descriptions of kind of heart perfection are not, they're not only are they not what we are, they're sort of not something that we will attain this side of paradise. You know, that they don't they we can, I feel we can sort of discern them living in us as the sort of spirit produces a new man. But we always, I think, discern in a kind of split personality way, that great Pauline sort of discovery of the old man and the new man occupying the same body at the same time. And so even as as many factions in America kind of lose their sense of themselves as religious, or outright sort of deny or set themselves against the church, it seems that we are often kind of playing out these tensions inherent in the Christian life. And that one thing religion and faith can do for us is simply make us self-aware about those things. I mean, this is the true meaning to me of confession, you know, is that since you're already worshiping something, since you're already, you know, at an infinite remove from that something, since you're already ashamed, you know, since you already feel the distance between you and the perfection, you know, why not fess up? Like, why not put the plainest and most direct language on that's available, namely the language of faith in Scripture? I mean, the inadequacy of sort of scientific and even just strictly political language for talking about these sorts of things is precisely that it has no categories for kind of acknowledging all of these things, or at least their categories are more unwieldy and partial than the ones available ready-made in the Christian church. And so this kind of brings me to the intuition that one of the first planks of this shared kind of acknowledgement that we're talking about needing to build is going to have to be, it probably doesn't have to be, you know, Christian of any particular denomination, but certainly has to be supernaturalist and theistic. You know, I mean, it's like you can't even address the questions we're describing without first saying, well, what we're talking about is our relationship with the infinite and our sort of the moral burden that places upon us. And since, again, everybody is kind of doing that always, this seems like a good place simply to start. It's to say, you know, well, first things first, we're sort of asking, what collectively can we affirm as a nation about our situation relative to that which is beyond nature. It seems like that's already written into our founding documents. There's no way out.
Yeah, that's one of the whereas on one hand I worry about the viability of liberalism and even secularism, which I think is sort of this secret sister of the church. I also worry about its passing, because one of the remarkable things, and again, this very much follows, Tom Holland's thesis and some of the conversations, some of the reading I've done of him with respect to the rise of secularism. Secularism has been in some ways one of the most remarkable evangelistic tools of promoting the ideas of Jesus while keeping his signature off the ideas. Because
Wow.
I mean, deep in Tom Holland's thesis is that, one of the things that I try to remind people in the Christian Reformed Church is they're having this fight about same-sex marriage is, we wouldn't be having this fight without Jesus. Because it's this ethic to the dispossessed that in the church sort of raises our imagination of, hey, wait a minute, this Jesus is, again, he's both radically exclusive and he's radically inclusive. And the same preacher who preaches what you just quoted in the Sermon on the Mount, when he goes to the house of the Pharisee, allows the woman of ill repute to wash his feet and let down her hair to scandalize the viewers. And it is that Jesus that continues to sort of continues to disrupt us. He's the same preacher says, I did not come to bring peace but a sword, and who also promises life in abundance. And so and part of what's been interesting for me, and again, it wasn't until I sort of accidentally, I don't even know how I managed to do what I did over the last few years, but accidentally developed a following and demanded that this following that I demanded of the people who watch my videos that a good number of them come out from behind the screens and actually share their lives with me so we can share it with each other. In getting to know many of the Jewish friends that I have now, that we'll have to continue to talk about that word Jesus, and we'll have to continue to deal with that label Christian. And I think that will be an ongoing part of the conversation. My pushback amongst the sort of weaponizing of the term Christian nationalism is, have you looked at the history of the United States? In what ways were the Puritans, I mean, how on earth, you can read, let's see if I got the book right here. You can read, so George Marsden was one of my history teachers at Calvin College. The first page of George Marsden's The Secularization of America, the Academy, writes about the reality why at Duke University there's a cathedral right there at the middle of Duke University, and pretty much every Yale. Why does it all look like a church? For pity's sake. So this question of the relationship between America and Christianity, and the way in which Jesus becomes Lord of all, even for those who sort of bristle at his name, which I think is really the thesis of Tom Holland's book, Dominion. He becomes Lord of all, even as many, even as atheists, the likes of Sam Harris, as Rene Girard noted, use Christianity against itself. And Bishop Barron made the same observation with him. So this seems to be the rather unusual place we are now. And I try to encourage people to say, I really wouldn't count Jesus out. He just seems to have a way of of being a very hard man to dispose of. He
He's the
just
comeback
keeps
kid, as we all know.
That's right. He just keeps popping in and popping
Yeah.
back. And as soon as you think you're away from him, you realize that just about everything that you've brought to the table, actually in one way or another, he either brought forward from his tradition or he stressed his tradition with it. So
Amen. Amen.
that I think we will probably I think this was really good. I think I'm quite confident that, especially when we add Michael into the mix, we're gonna have a lot to talk about in Washington, D.C.
I agree. I can't wait, and I really appreciate your being so generous with your time, and really looking forward to more. Thank you.
Very good. Well, thank you, Spencer. I'm going to end the recording, and
Perfect.